Hey, this is Joseph Pack again. This week is going to be Holy Week. We're celebrating Palm Sunday right now, and as we go into the following days, we'll be looking at Good Friday and eventually next Sunday looking at Easter. You know, many years when I was living at home, my parents would take me to this thing that was led by a what you call a Messianic congregation or a Messianic Jewish congregation, and it was a Passover Seder, which is when Jews will observe the feast of Passover, and they'll recount how God saved them out of bondage in the land of Egypt. However, as Messianics, they take a little bit of a different spin on things. They don't just look at the miracle of God saving the Jews out of the land of Israel, but they look at the much bigger picture and how those events in Passover correlate with what took place during Holy Week and what Christ actually did on the cross when God saved us from a much bigger bondage, that is the bondage of sin, by dying on the cross and eventually raising from the dead. So that being said, this is a tradition that, as I've become a leader in my church and become one of the ministers or pastors or whatever you want to call it over there, I've tried to lead a similar type of thing with my own church family so that they could kind of share in this experience, because I think it helps you to connect with what's taking place during Holy Week in a way that maybe we haven't done before. It maybe helps us to understand a little bit better the events that were taking place throughout the following week, in a way that we may be lacking the context with kind of our modern day 2020 way of thinking. And that's really what the whole purpose of going through these Messianic Passover Seders is to have that better connection with what was taking place over this week. Because we need to remember that Christ himself was showing up to Jerusalem intentionally on this week of Passover, and many of the events that took place within his own life correlate with what the observances of Passover were in the day. So what I want to show you is I want to show you a little bit here just what it is I would go through with my own group of people at Bowling Green Baptist Church. This year, because of the coronavirus and everybody staying at home, obviously we're not going to be able to do this. I'm hoping to be able to do something like this just with my wife and my daughter, so that we can kind of keep the tradition alive inside of our own homes. And maybe you can do the same thing. If you want a copy of this Haggadah, which is what this program is basically called, I'm more than happy to share it with you so that you can kind of look over it. And if you want to do something, it doesn't have to be super big or ornate. But if you want to do something within your own home, I think it's a great way to be able to connect with Good Friday in a way that's more than just kind of looking, saying it's on the calendar, and then kind of going on with your day. So I'm not going to walk through this Word document, but I at least just kind of wanted to show you what was there. So, I mean, you can clearly kind of see, yes, there's a Word document. But what this would do is it would actually walk through every single thing that we go through when we go through the Passover Seder. So what you end up seeing when you go through here is there's a little bit of a setup that talks about Palm Sunday and what takes place. There is a little bit of Bible study kind of stuff, but the big thing is you start getting into these different cups, and with these different cups you observe different aspects of God's salvation of his people out of Egypt. And again, as Messianics, we relate this to the way that we see Christ providing us salvation through his son Jesus Christ. So you go through here and there's a whole night of different activities. There is the what most people would argue is the most important part, which is the actual meal itself. And then eventually we get into some things that we'll talk about here in a second. But again, this is available. If you want this, feel free to let me know, either by leaving a comment to this video, or if you have my email address, feel free to contact me that way, or my phone, or however you want to. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to a couple view graphs that I use usually when I'm talking about this. This is really what I wanted to talk with a lot of you guys today, was at least go through this piece of the puzzle and try to understand at a high level, why is this so important? Why is Holy Week itself so important? And what's the significance behind the way that Christ himself would have been experiencing and wanting other people to experience this week? Because let's remember, all of these characters that we see in the Bible were all good observant Jews. And as good observant Jews, this is the context within which they would have been seeing the season. It's not too different than us watching a movie where the backdrop of the movie is Christmas time. and then being able to connect with it a little bit differently because we understand the season, we understand the events taking place. That's really all we're trying to do right here, is understand the context of what's taking place around all these things Jesus is doing and saying with his disciples. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So right here you can see a timeline of different days. Now, there's something you're going to notice about these days. You see down there at the very bottom how you have this 10th day of Nisan. Well, Nisan is this month in the Jewish calendar, and it's the month in which God told his people, I want you to observe Passover. So pretty clear cut and simple. God said observe this feast during this time, and that's when the Jews did it. So what you can also see is I tried to overlay the fact that, in the scriptures we see examples of Christ doing different things on every single day, but we also see just kind of at a big macro level, so just kind of at a high level, what Christ was doing and how that maybe shifted perception a little bit to his disciples, maybe as they were going through everything, but certainly as they would have been looking back on Jesus's life and his experiences there on earth. This is certainly something that would have been fresh in their mind. So the first thing that we see is over here, the lambs being selected for sacrifice. So you see, during Passover, it was this time when people would show up to the temple, they would offer their sacrifices, and then they would observe the traditional feasts and celebrations of the night of Passover, and then there would have been a kind of a special Sabbath that took place on the next day. So what we end up seeing, though, is that the lambs would be selected in the very beginning of the week. And it's because over the next several days, and what you see on the top of that arrow there, is that the lambs would be inspected to determine if they were suitable to be sacrificed at the temple. Well, this becomes very interesting as a Christian because we look at this and say, well, this is very similar to how Jesus himself was being treated throughout the entire week. You see, he was being questioned and quizzed by the Pharisees and the Sadducees to determine if he was really who he claimed he was. And really, in reality, their intent was not really to determine who he was, but to try to catch him. You see, they were trying to find some sort of fault in anything about who he was. Now, what we know is that Christ didn't end up having any of those blemishes they were looking for. And at the end of the day, they ended up having to trump up these charges, trying to go to Pontius Pilate and to convince him that Christ was a threat to Roman rule and authority in the area of Judea. Well, what's interesting about this is that this period of inspection, in the same way the lambs were inspected, and finally on the day that they would be sacrificed, it would be determined and it would be announced that these lambs were blemishless and without any flaw in them, that timeline correlates precisely with the timeline where Christ would be inspected, and ultimately it would culminate to this event where he would be standing in front of Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate would announce that I see no fault in this man. So you see, in the exact same way that the lambs, the sacrificial lambs, were being inspected and judged to be pure, Christ was also being inspected and would be judged ultimately to be pure before he would be crucified, as what we know of was what Paul calls the Passover lamb. So, as we continue to move forward, I wanted to show you something that you might have noticed. You might have looked at that last slide and kind of counted up the days and said, well, wait a minute, Joseph, that doesn't actually add up to an entire week. Because if I sit here and I count Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I get 6 days. But then on your arrow, you only had 5 days. Now, why is that? Well, that's why we have this chart right here. So this is kind of my cartoony way of trying to explain how Jewish days overlapped a little bit differently than our days. So you ended up having a day would actually start at sundown and then would end at the next sundown. So rather than our days, which I guess technically go from midnight to midnight, or even just colloquially, you would probably think of it as being the day and the night. In reality, there was darkness and then light in the mind of the Jews. So this is an homage, so to speak, or an observance of the fact that when you look at the story of creation, there was darkness, and then God said, let there be light. And that is referred to as the first day. So you see there's darkness and then there's light. And that's why they look at their days, and they started at sundown and then go to the next sundown, what we would consider the following day. So because of that, that's why you end up with this weird 5 days versus 6 days kind of thing. Now, there's one other thing, because there's some debate within, especially more contemporary scholars, where some people will look at, that there's this attempt. I want to be careful how I say this, to look at the scriptures and maybe kind of take some of the Jewishness off of the life of Christ. And I'm not saying it's for nefarious reasons or anything, but there is this school of thought that has some very good arguments that explains that, in reality, Christ wasn't really, like the Last Supper wasn't really a Passover Seder. The context is off. And one of the arguments there that I have to admit was challenging for me as I was looking at it, because I don't subscribe to that particular belief, is that, Christ would have been crucified on Good Friday. So then how would he have had a Passover Seder then on what basically we would call Thursday? How would that actually work out? Well, here's how that works out, is because there were actually 2 separate days that the Jews would offer their sacrifices. It depended how you affiliated. The individuals who affiliated more with Jerusalem would have actually conducted their sacrifices on Friday. And see, because they conducted their sacrifices on Friday, you would take the meat from those sacrifices. That would be the meat that you end up roasting. And then that would be your Passover Seder then, before sundown on Friday night. Friday afternoon, I guess you would say. But if you were from Galilee, then the Galileans would actually conduct their sacrifices on Thursday. So, and there are a multitude of reasons for that. The most practical reason being that you had all these individuals who were traveling from every corner of, the known earth, I guess, so to speak there, and coming to the temple, and they were all offering their sacrifices. So, I mean, as you can imagine, it was packed. I mean, just hundreds of thousands, if not possibly millions of people there conducting sacrifices. Things got busy. And because things got busy, the practical side of it is it does help to kind of separate things a little bit. And so the thinking then is that Jesus, as somebody who was from Galilee, would have been an individual who would have gone in on Thursday, conducted his sacrifice, and done his Passover Seder then on Thursday night. So that's kind of like your history lesson, so to speak, of this whole thing and how that all lays out. But what did the Passover Seder look like? Well, you end up having the evening being separated into these 4 separate cups, and these cups have blessings that are associated with them and meanings associated with every single one of them. With the first cup, you look at sanctification, so the fact that the people of Israel were sanctified and put apart separately. As Christians, we look at it and we understand that when we accept Christ into our lives, a part of that is our old self dying off and becoming a new creation in Christ. Effectively, we are now sanctified. We are now made different and set apart from the rest of the sinful world because we have made this decision to follow Christ and to be made new. And Christ makes us new. That sanctifies us from the old life that we used to know and the things we used to be affiliated with. It's not to say that we don't still struggle with the exact same things and have many of the same flaws, but it is to say that God in that moment turns and says, you are my child. You are an individual that I have called for something much bigger than whatever you lived for before. So the old you has died off and you are now made new. The second cup that is observed throughout the night is the cup of judgment. So this is the cup where the Jews would begin looking at the fact that the different plagues that took place, where Pharaoh's heart was hardened and where he was all the plagues were exacted onto the people of Egypt for not letting God's people go. As Christians, we look at this and we also begin to observe the judgment, not the judgment that Christ suffered on the cross, but we look at the judgment of the actual judgment of sin, our own bondage that we suffer, not to some superpower like Egypt, but our bondage to sin and the fact that there is this very real bitterness, this very real sorrow associated with the fact that we can't save ourselves, that we are helpless to save ourselves. And so when you begin to look at that, you begin to see where, some of these phrases pop up that we talk about in, theological circles, where you talk about, being destitute and whatnot. So that being said, during the Passover Seder, there are these different implements, elements, so to speak, I guess you'd call them, that are in this Seder plate, where you're going through and you're pointing at these different things, or sometimes you're eating these different foods, and you're doing it in order to connect with these ideas of sanctification and judgment. When you talk about judgment, one of the things that you do is you actually have this thing that they call the maror, or the bitter herb. So maror is basically horseradish. Think of it that way. So it's this horseradish, and what you would do is you get a piece of matzah and or unleavened bread, and you would dip it in the maror. And the whole idea is you're supposed to take just enough of it that when you eat it, it brings a tear to the eye. And with that tear, it's supposed to make you remember the bitterness and the harshness and the sorrow of the bondage of the people of Israel in Egypt. As Christians, the sorrow of our bondage that we cannot help ourselves from due to sin. That thing where we must have a God that is much bigger than ourselves and much bigger than our own power to be able to free ourselves from. Now, this becomes interesting because the thinking of a lot of theologians and whatnot who have studied these sorts of things is that this is the point in our own observance of the Last Supper, where it is thought that the bread was broken, and it said it was, and in the scriptures it says the bread was dipped into the dish, and then it was passed, and Christ said, whoever I pass this to is the person who will betray me. And that's how we know that Jesus ended up basically identifying Judas as the individual who would betray him and ultimately sell him off. So the reason why that becomes important is because when it talks about the dish, that's the thing that a lot of people are honing in on. That the dish is, they're typically these dishes that people would use to put the maror into the dish. And so when he was dipping, that's there's a significance of the word even dip, where they would dip the maror. And that's the thinking of, that's the connection right there. So you can even see the connection of the sorrow and the bitterness due to sin, and then also see how that relates to the identification of ultimately the treachery that Judas would commit. So finally, as we continue going on into the night, we get to the point where we begin looking at redemption. And there is this very, very interesting connection between what we know as Christians and what the Jews would have been celebrating then, and what many of them still celebrate today. And that is that when they look at redemption, that when they look at the cup of redemption, it's the whole idea that they have this toast that they give, this blessing that they give, and is this blessing where they are identifying that the redemption that only God can bring is going to come. To the Jews, has come and brought them out of the place of Egypt. As Christians, bringing us out of our sin and bringing us to a new life. This is something that we should all know. And this is something we should all be very familiar with, because it is in this part of the Passover Seder where, just as before, you grab this piece of bread and you end up blessing this bread. Again, a piece of matzah. There's significance to this matzah because this matzah is referred to as something called the afikomen. It's something that previously in the night we said a blessing and it had meaning and just as everything else during the Passover Seder, but we actually took the matzah and we broke it. And the idea is that this piece of matzah represented the priesthood, and so we broke it because it represented the breaking of God and man. And the separation in between them. And you get half this piece of matzah and you hide it away. So at this point in time during the night, it would be brought back out. And you bring up this piece of matzah that represented the brokenness in between man and God, called the afikomen. And you would break it and you would bless it. And you'd pass around and everybody would eat some of it. This is when Christ would have broken the bread and passed it and said, "This is my body given for you." Do you get that connection? That connection between God saying, here's the brokenness in between God and man, and this is my body. My body will be broken to restore this connection. In the same way, Christ would take the cup. He would take the cup that represents the redemption of mankind, the redemption of this people who had been separated and lost by powers that they can't control, and it would restore the connection in between God and his creation once again. that Christ would pick up this cup and he would take this and he would bless it. But when he would bless it on this night, instead of giving just the traditional blessing, he would say, "This is my blood. Drink it and do this in remembrance of me." And so once again, you see this connection between the fact that the Jews, the disciples who were Jewish would have been observing this night, and they wouldn't have just been seeing breaking a piece of bread or drinking something out of a cup as some kind of random thing that they'll do in the future. They would have seen a very real connection in between how they have always thought of these things and who the person of Christ is, understanding that it is the body of Christ, which is the thing that will repair the relationship between God and man. It is the spilt blood of Christ that will be the redemption of man from sin. And that is a big connection. That is a big piece of context that a lot of times we end up missing when we just read the story of Good Friday as people in the year 2020 in the Western world. What I've done in the past when I've actually given this as a sermon or a piece of a sermon is there's usually a video clip that I like to play after this that's just kind of something that helps us to kind of reflect on some of these events that take place during Holy Week. So what I would like to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and play this video. And I'm going to have a link, at least to the YouTube listing of this video down in the description. You're more than welcome to look at it later. But for right now, if you just take a couple of minutes and go ahead and watch this and just kind of reflect on some of these events that take place over the following week. So as we go throughout the next week, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that this isn't just another holiday. This isn't just another moment on the Christian calendar. And even though I know that we may not live in a society that's found a way to make Easter quite as big of a deal as some of the other holidays that we have, it's something that as Christians we should understand the tremendous significance that this holiday has, and that this moment has on who we are and everything that we stand for. That it isn't just about death. It isn't even just about life. It's not just about a bunch of stories in the Bible and a bunch of odd things that happened to some society 2,000 years ago. This is about the redemption of God's creation. This is about the fact that you have a God who loved his creation, his people, his children so much that he would give anything, even death on a cross, in order to help us to understand exactly what sin cost and what God is willing to pay. The purpose of this entire moment is not supposed to be something that we just kind of casually observe and becomes another part of our orthodoxy as Christians. It's something that is supposed to help us in being able to see and understand the glory of God. That is why Christ died on the cross. Not in particular because he needed you or me to be a disciple or a worshiper, not because he needed some display of his power or anything like that. It was because God just simply is glorious. And what better way to demonstrate his love to his creation than to communicate to us that he is willing to show that glory to us in a way that reconciles us all back together. God is desperately in love with every single one of us. God wants to have a relationship with every single one of us. That is the story of Easter. That is what we are living for, what we are celebrating during this time. So I know that we're all isolated. I know that there are people who are, some people are dealing with illness of their own. Some people are just scared. Some people are just suffering from a tremendous amount of anxiety right now. But don't let any of these things distract us from the fact that there is something much greater than any circumstance that we live in right now. And that is salvation through Jesus Christ. Take this holiday, take this time together, this time ironically to get together as we're all apart, to reach out to people that you know, to be able to share this gift that you have, this thing that you have heard about. Share this good news with other people around you. Even people who you think may have attended church their entire lives, still share it. Talk about it. Make sure to share this gift with other individuals, within your homes, within your families. Pray about this, observe it. Don't just let the day go by as just another Sunday simply because you don't have the opportunity to put on pretty dresses and clothes and show up to a sunrise service. Make this holiday something special. Make it something that's truly deserving of reflecting the glory of Christ to the world around us. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that you have a great week. I hope that everybody stays healthy. And even if you're not staying healthy, I hope that everybody has this peace and has this joy that they're able to be able to feel and experience as we recognize the most joyful thing that ever took place, which is Christ's conquering of death on the cross and eventually his resurrection from the tomb.